If you're a gigging drummer, you've definitely had to play in a small room before. And if you haven't yet and you aspire to be a gigging drummer, you're definitely not going to want to miss these crucial tips I'm going to give you today. I'm condensing my 9 years of experience playing professionally into 3 strategies and a whole bunch of tips for sounding awesome and really pulling off playing well quietly in a tiny room. From gear adjustments and drum tuning to subtle hand and finger techniques and even influential psychological shifts, we're covering everything. Here are 3 strategies for sounding amazing in any small venue. Hey everybody, welcome to The Non-Glamorous Drummer, the channel all about teaching you the most important core drumming skills that help you make music better and faster. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Also download my free guide below, your checklist to mastering the hi-hats. Learn how to play one-handed 16ths, open hat barks, and left foot independence, all in 9 simple, easy to follow lessons. It's yours free. I've divided this lesson really into 3 main sections, and in the first section we're talking about gear techniques and gear choice for playing well quietly. Second one, we're going to be talking about technique that helps us play well quietly, more comfortably. And then lastly, mental, psychological shifts that can actually help us approach it differently, which also helps a lot. First big point here as we start talking about gear really isn't exactly gear related, but it's so important I got to say it first. And if you're having to play quietly, don't grip your sticks down here. Grip a little bit further up. If it's a Vic Firth pair of sticks, thumbs almost to the H's, at least on the American flags, if not the H. Yeah, I mean, you could go up to the H or even the T in Firth. And that just gives you a lot more balance as you're playing. So you've got more weight from the butt end of the stick that's helping lessen the weight of the stick going into the drum. So instead of really hitting the drum and going into it, you can really just bounce off of it. And so that can really help change your approach and even your mindset going into it. So that's super important, number 1 tip. And so I know it's not really gear related, but I had to say that first. So now getting into the rest of the gear tips. First off, use lighter weight sticks. Make it as easy for yourself as possible. So don't use your 5B hickory sticks. Throw those aside. Instead, get some maple sticks. I really like the Vic Firth Heritage series. That's what they call their maple line. So these are the 5A, the AH5A, American Heritage 5A. So it's same size as a standard 5A pair, but they're made of maple instead of hickory, so they weigh less. So these are super light, and so I can feel really comfortable just playing lightly. These sticks just kind of feel like they float along. They just glide and they float. And so when you combine gripping up here with lighter 5A sticks, it works great. Don't use a crash cymbal on your setup. If I were playing a quiet gig, honestly, I would just take this cymbal off because I don't want the temptation of playing a crash. If I need a nice little wash of sound, I can do that on the ride. Or I can do it on the hats. There's plenty of times that I'll hit an open hat note and just let it sizzle. That's my crash. Maybe broaden your horizons a little bit and think about playing a crash on the hi-hats. Or you could even use your foot. Sort of a splash sizzle like that. That could be your crash. Or just a nice little wash on the ride. You don't need a crash cymbal, so avoid that temptation. That's going to help you stay quieter on the cymbals. Also, don't tune your drum super low. And this especially applies to the toms and floor tom. If you tune really low, the toms might sound great if you're hitting really hard and if they're close mic'd, and so you can get a lot of that low end tone and beef going through a PA. That's great. But if you're playing in a small room and you're playing lightly, you need to tune up a little higher so you can still maintain some perceived tone from your listener's perspective. If your drums are super low, that low end growl just isn't going to make it to your audience if they're out there. And so even though it might sound okay to you here, tune your drums a little higher so you can get some warmth and just some nice tone when you're playing lightly. The way I have these tuned right now, this is borderline too low. I think if I were going to play a quiet gig, I would bring these up just a little bit. Just for a nicer tone. We just want to bring up the warmth a little bit, because if you think about it, If a head is tuned super loose, you've got to put more energy into it to really get it in motion. But if a head is tuned higher, you can just barely tap it or hit it with your hand and it's in motion and you're getting great tone. So now part 2, technique basics. So we already covered the number 1 crucial technique, but there's a little more detail we can go into and a few more things we can think about and practice in preparation for a quiet playing gig. Number 1, this is kind of a simple, obvious thing, but most of the time we don't do it. And that is practice everything that you're already practicing quietly. So if you're working on grooves from a method book, or you're working on a song, or there's a particular part you're working on, just practice playing that quietly. Maybe you're working on a basic, I don't know, just a basic groove. Practice that same groove really lightly. And if you're working on some rudiments, singles, doubles, whatever warm-ups you do in your practice routine, we all should be doing some basic 8s every time we practice. Practice those quietly. And so on. Practice your doubles lightly. I'll flip the snares off so you can hear a little better. It gets really tough when you go really quiet. You're having to figure out where that crossover point is between bounce and actually controlling the motion, which leads us into another tip. And that is when you're playing lightly, when you're playing very quietly, you've got to bring your fingers in a little tighter so that you've got more control over the stick. If you were just gripping like this maybe, you could get by playing loud. But if we're playing lightly, we really have to have the stick touching the palm of our hand. We have to have more control here and a little bit tighter of a grip so we can control every bit of the motion. This is the opposite of the loose, let it move within your hand that we want to do when we're playing loudly. We want this when we're playing loud, but we want this when we're playing softly. Because when we're going that soft, we can't really rely so much on rebound, because rebound is going to cause us to play too fast if we're going slow. Maybe if we're going faster, like that might feel a little more natural, or if we're playing really fast doubles, those are totally rebound. But if we're playing really slow, right, right, left, left, we have to manually play each note. So that means bringing the fingers in, controlling that motion. And something George Lawrence Stone talks about in the introduction for Stick Control, his famous book, he says you got to practice these quietly to gain control. It's a really profound point he makes, that quiet playing leads to control. And so practice all the rudiments and the warm-ups, the exercises, and the grooves that you're already practicing very quietly, because that's going to lead to control. And yes, that requires a lot of patience. It definitely requires a lot of patience to sit here and go. Especially when you're doing doubles. Where you're trying to figure out, okay, do I individually play these or do I let them bounce? There's a crossover tempo. Right there, I'm pretty much doing them individually, but if I go a little faster, then it becomes bounce, so it gets a little easier. So find those tricky tempos and practice, going back and forth across that threshold. And your control is going to get much better. You're going to learn how to use your fingers to really control, which is going to make your grace notes a lot cleaner if you're playing a quiet groove. We'll talk a little bit more about grace notes in a second. So our part 3 here, these are our overarching mental concepts, our psychological shifts that can actually help us go into a quiet playing gig with a much better attitude, for one thing, but also a much higher satisfaction in playing quietly. Because a lot of times what happens when we're setting up in a small room, it kind of feels like a bummer, like, in this small room, I'm gonna have to play lightly, I can't hit cymbals hard, I can't play rim shots, I've got to really watch my volume, which means I'm not gonna have fun tonight. It's gonna be harder making music, because we're supposed to hit drums, we're not supposed to just tap. And I'm not playing jazz, we're not playing like a bossa nova here in this venue tonight, we're playing a rock gig. And so how am I gonna play all this stuff quietly? And a lot of times that attitude and that kind of frustration just leads to the whole night being a drag, and the whole thing just being a bummer of disappointment and frustration with not being able to play as loud as you want to. So that's something that really you've got to fix and be prepared for going into it. A lot of times, if you know you're going to be playing in a small restaurant or bar, you can't go into that with the mindset of you're going to play hard. You've got to be mentally prepared that, okay, I might need to play quieter tonight, and that's going to be my fun challenge that I'm gonna approach, and I'm gonna enjoy doing this. I'm gonna try to sound as best I can playing quietly. And honestly, the biggest part of that is you have to relax. I remember practicing my quiet playing, and there was a particular groove that was kind of like, it's kind of like that, where it was an alternating 16th thing. Basically, the groove would want to be a little more loud, a little more full-on volume, kind of like. Something maybe kind of like that, and instead I was having to play it. And I realized I was struggling to really maintain that dynamic and maintain steady time because I was wanting to rush. A lot of times when you're having to play more lightly, you tend to rush because it's easier to play faster if you're playing light. We could play super fast quietly because there's not a lot of motion that has to happen. And so you have to fight that tendency, but rather than fighting the tendency, if you can relax into it and just think, okay, I'm gonna play relaxed, quietly, slowly, whatever the tempo is, it gets a lot easier. Or even quieter than that. And so when you're staying super loose and relaxed and just thinking smooth and you're keeping your shoulders and your neck relaxed, it's a lot easier to keep things from rushing and keep things from getting louder. And that helps lock you into that mindset of just quiet, relaxed, calm, chill playing. But also be aware of your mix. Be aware of whatever your new dynamic ceiling needs to be. Like if the loudest you can get is maybe this. That right there is pretty loud for a small room because the hats are getting open. I'm giving it a decent backbeat. Maybe that's the absolute loudest. So we know, okay, that's our volume ceiling. So we also want to think about where's our volume floor. If we've had to lower our volume ceiling, we will also want to be able to lower our volume floor, and that's where the quiet playing comes in. We want to be able to play really clean, quiet grace notes. So if you know, okay, this is the loudest I can go, but I can also go this quiet, you're still getting that contrast, and that's very important. We want to have the contrast. That way, from the listener's perspective, it sounds like you still have this huge dynamic range, and you're still able to start here, and maybe grow to here. And you're able to grow it to a decent climactic kind of feel, as loud as you can maybe get. So as long as you always have that in mind, this is how loud I can be, this is how quiet I can be, you know what space you have to work with. So mix yourself accordingly. Always be aware of those dynamics and just keeping everything mixed properly within the new context of whatever room you're in. Now, in doing all of this, you also have to be okay with changing up your parts. This is kind of the final thing with the psychological shift and approaching this as a fun challenge and not a bummer. Let's say you've got to play When You Were Young by the Killers. So if you were playing this the way Ronnie Vannucci played it on the record, it would probably sound like. And so it would at least be something crazy like that and going nuts on the toms. Same with like Mr. Brightside, another big rock and roll killer song. And the thing is, you can't play it that way if you're going to play it in a small venue. Now, if you're playing with a band that does big rock stuff, hopefully you're sticking to larger venues. But if you are in a smaller venue and you've got to play a song like that, you've got to be willing to sacrifice the parts that you're playing. And maybe for the beginning of the song, be okay with playing something like. So So we've still got a wash of sound. Instead of crashing on the ride, we're washing with sort of a hi-hat sizzle. The notes are still there, and in the verse, all the parts can still be there with the floor tom. We're just keeping things lighter. And so again, we know that our ceiling might be this right here. That means we've got to keep our floor really low and be able to bring things back in the verses so we can still push things up in the choruses. So be willing to sacrifice your parts. I know that we always want to play for the song. We always talk about playing for the song, but playing for the room trumps playing for the song. Because if you're in a small venue and you're like, I'm going to play for the song, I'm going to give the song what it needs, the listener is not going to enjoy it because you're going to sound horrible. You're going to sound really bad in the room, and you need to sound good. The band needs to sound good. It's no good if you play the song like the record if it's so loud that the listener can't even hear the vocal and can't hear anything beyond the wash of cymbal. So you've got to ultimately play for the room, keeping the song in mind, trying to be as true as you can to the original parts, maintaining the vibe, and the parts and the rhythms that are there, but just bring everything down. So I know we've covered a lot of ground today, and so just to review, number one thing, choke up on your sticks a little further. If you're playing hard, like if we're playing killer stuff on a big stage, grip down here, use a lot of stick, that's great. But if you're playing lightly, you gotta bring your grip further up, just so you're closer to that balancing point of the stick. That way you've got less stick weight, it's easier to just float along and play lightly, that's huge. Also use lighter weight sticks, maple sticks are great. Get rid of your crash so the temptation isn't there. Tune your toms up a little bit for more warmth and more tone so they sound great played lightly. Practice everything you're already practicing, just do it quietly. Practice any groove quietly. Practice it different ways, you know, washing on the ride or with open hats, but also close things down and practice it tightly, even with cross stick. Practice quiet doubles, practice quiet rudiments, and be patient because that quiet practice leads to control, and that's going to help a bunch going into a quiet gig. Relax and enjoy playing quietly, and take pride in maybe being that one drummer out there who actually sounds really good in that room. You know the room. Maybe there's a room that you play in a bunch that your band plays in, and you've heard other bands play in there, and the drummers are always too loud. Be the one drummer who sounds really good. You want the venue owner to come up to you later and say, hey, thanks for not playing too loud. Thanks for not making our ears bleed. That's a great thing, and that's something we as drummers need to be very aware of. So take pride, take satisfaction in that. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope this lesson has helped you out. Before you go download the free guide below, your checklist for mastering the hi-hats, 9 strategies for improving hi-hat 16ths, open note barks and cuts, left foot coordination. This is just a great way to get a good well-rounded education on the hi-hat, so go check that out. It's yours totally free. Thanks guys so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already if you're new to the channel. I will see you next week on the next video. Until then, take care guys.